Ooh, Andrew Davies. Ooh, Andrew Davies. Ooh, Andrew Davies on my TV. Hello, I'm Tim and I have too many books. Today I'm going to talk about Andrew Davies, an adapter of novels. Is he the best known? Very probably. The best? Certainly the most prominent in the English-speaking world. He was born in 1936 and started writing for the BBC, for radio, and then for television in the 1960s, having his first television breakthrough in 1967. He's won 4 BAFTA awards for his adaptations of novels and has probably been the preeminent adapter of classic novels for a few decades now. He's created 5 Austen adaptations, 3 Michael Dobbs adaptations, and then 2 each of Dickens, Trollope, Eliot, Waters, Delderfield, Henry Fielding and Kingsley Amis. He didn't turn to full-time writing until the late 80s. Before that he'd been a teacher and then a university lecturer. I'm going to give you a personal selection of highlights from his adaptations of novels. And I'm also going to include another one at the end, which is slightly different. We start with To Serve Them All My Days by R.F. Delderfield. This is one of R.F. Delderfield's sagas, I suppose, where he follows a character over a number of decades. We are dealing with a man called David Powlett-Jones. He is a coal miner's son who has a decent education and in the First World War has become an officer. We meet him as a somewhat shell-shocked veteran who has returned from the war and comes to teach at a public school in the English countryside. This was Andrew Davies's first major television adaptation. He had adapted a Dickens short story before this. This was a very well received adaptation, although it has to be said that Andrew Davies started as he intended to continue. In the original novel, the character of David Powlett-Jones is married 3 times. His first marriage ends in tragedy when his wife and one of his twin daughters is killed in a car accident. The other twin daughter survives but is badly injured and has a limp for the rest of her life. Andrew Davies saw this and didn't really feel comfortable at depicting as he put it, a young woman clomping her way through the rest of the adaptation. So in the adaptation he decided that both twins had to die. Andrew Davies continued to adapt work throughout the 1980s, but also wrote a lot of his original stuff. He created a children's television character called Marmalade Atkins, who was very popular in its day, and also made quite a mark with a very peculiar practice. This TV series is about a medical centre at a very modern university and the machinations. It does have some rather eccentric characters. It also includes some very feral nuns. The next adaptation I want to talk about is his 1989 adaptation of the 1983 book Mother Love by Domini Taylor. This starred Diana Rigg and David McCullum, who you may know from NCIS. As I remember this series, it marked something of a turning point in Diana Rigg's career. She had come to prominence in the 1960s as Emma Peel in the British television series The Avengers, nothing to do with the comic books. She played a character called Emma Peel, which was a pun on the idea of man appeal. And she went on being the very attractive woman even as she got older. And it was Mother Love that marked the turning point in her career where she suddenly becomes a mother of adult children. Now, Mother Love is about a woman who is very protective towards her son. Her son is getting married and is reconnecting with her ex-husband, his father. Her ex-husband has remarried and seemingly has a very happy new family life. This story of possessive jealousy might remind people a little bit of the story of Medea, and the name Domini Taylor might suggest that we are going to have a feminist retelling. But when you find out about Domini Taylor, maybe it's more like a Bitches Be Crazy retelling. Domini Taylor is one of many pseudonyms used by a writer called Roger Longrig. And I have to say I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole in investigating his books. In the 1960s, he published a book called The Passion Flower Hotel, which is about a group of girls at a private boarding school who decide to open a house of negotiable virtue to service a local private boys' boarding school. He was at the time pretending that this book was authored by a teenage girl, and in fact wrote 2 sequels to this book before he was uncovered. Using another female pseudonym, Roger Longrigg also wrote Vices and Virtues, which is an erotic retelling of Jane Austen's Persuasion set during Edwardian times. Investigating Roger Longrigg, he does look absolutely fascinating, but he's definitely not fit for decent society. His books do seem to be marketed often as comedies, whether it is the cheeky comedy of the Passion Flower Hotel or the darker black comedy of Mother Love. Mother Love gained Diana Rigg a BAFTA award, and I'm not sure that the adaptation was really seen as a comedy. The next adaptation we're going to talk about is House of Cards by Michael Dobbs. You may recognise the name of this book. This is the same House of Cards that was adapted into an American television series, which was very well received, even with its somewhat controversial lead character. In the United States, the anti-hero is known as Frank Underwood, but in this book, in the British TV series that Andrew Davies adapted, he's known as Francis Urquhart. All the same, it's still FU. The story of this book tells the story of the Chief Whip, Francis Urquhart, who is dealing with the aftermath of the fall of Margaret Thatcher. This was written in 1989, and the series didn't come out until 1990, so Margaret Thatcher was still very much Prime Minister then, but this rather cheekily envisaged what would happen after she was gone. There is a reason that I'm holding up the first edition of this book. It is, after all, the only way I can guarantee that this book has the original ending. Now, there will be some spoilers for this book. In the original ending of the book, Matty Storin, a journalist who has become rather too entangled with Francis Urquhart in his rise to become Prime Minister, confronts the new PM on a roof terrace at the Houses of Parliament. She tells him that he's a bad 'un and that she is going to expose him to the world. As she is triumphantly leaving the Houses of Parliament into Parliament Square, she sees him plunging to his death from that same roof terrace. Andrew Davies clearly took one look at this ending and decided he could do something better, or more interesting. I haven't seen any indication of what Michael Dobbs originally thought about this, but all subsequent editions of this book have Andrew Davies's ending as worded by Michael Dobbs. Michael Dobbs went on to write 2 best-selling sequels to this book, both of which were adapted, of course, by Andrew Davies. Our next adaptation is something of a personal choice for me because I like the author particularly. This is Angus Wilson's Anglo-Saxon Attitudes. Now, I know what you're thinking. Usually when you see a title like Anglo-Saxon Attitude, you're expecting a portentous and even pretentious dissertation on the cultural self-attitude of the English. I was a little bit worried about that when I picked up this book, but on the first page, it tells you where he got the title from. The title comes from Alice's Adventures Through the Looking Glass, in a scene where we encounter the Mad March Hare and the Mad Hatter. Once again, they are dressed as Anglo-Saxon messengers, and the hare, known as Haya, Haigha, is throwing shapes, posing in odd ways. And when asked about this, the Mad Hatter, known as Hatter, Hatta, says, well, those are his Anglo-Saxon attitudes. So, Lewis Carroll is clearly spoofing the notion of Anglo-Saxon attitudes, which of course is what Angus Wilson does as well. Angus Wilson was a rather interesting figure. He spent many years working at the British Museum Library. With Malcolm Bradbury, he helped set up the University of East Anglia's MA in creative writing. Graduate authors have so far garnered several Booker Prizes, and there is at least 1 Nobel Prize. Angus Wilson was knighted in 1980 and became something of seen as something of an establishment figure. But when you consider that he was openly gay and his books often have openly gay characters in them, this does seem a little bit odd. In fact, at the height of the panic over AIDS, which led to the Tory government under Margaret Thatcher enacting the infamous Section 28, a bookshop called Gaze Word in Bloomsbury, London, was threatened with closure, and people like Angus Wilson stepped forward to speak out against its possible closure. Gaze Word is still very much part of the Bloomsbury bookshop scene. Angus Wilson, for me, is one of those writers who looks at the world and sees the ridiculousness of it and tells us how foolish it is, even if he's dealing with very, very serious subjects. We don't like using the word wry or wryly in polite society, but you could perhaps see his worldview as a wry one. In this novel we have Gerald Middleton, who is a respected but rather dull archaeologist. He's reached his 60th birthday without really achieving anything. He's estranged from his rather eccentric wife, and his children, while seeing all the foibles and follies of his wife, prefer their mother very much to him. He is also nursing a long-term broken heart over a woman he once loved, who was the fiancée of his best friend. He is stirred into action in the novel when he is asked to investigate an archaeological dig carried out by his best friend's father, which he was peripherally involved in. The adaptation is, of course, very well done, very well cast, and has a lot of interesting people, including a very early performance by Kate Winslet. But I think it is a little bit po-faced and loses out on some of Angus Wilson's humour. We skip forward to 1994 and George Eliot's Middlemarch. By 1994, the BBC hadn't made any adaptations of classic Victorian or 19th century novels for 6 years. The BBC don't like to be seen as the British Bonnets Corporation, but at the same time they do also seem to be the only people who can be relied upon to produce decent, fairly accurate versions of classic novels. So it is a bit of a dilemma. 1994 marked a comeback of sorts. They produced Charles Dickens's Martin Chuzzlewit and, of course, George Eliot's Middlemarch. In what was something of an innovation for the BBC at the time, this was shot entirely on location. Middlemarch tells the story of the town of Middlemarch. One of the characters is Dorothea Brooke, who makes a perhaps imprudent marriage to a man called Casaubon, who is a very dry and academic reverend. He has a cousin who is slightly more interesting called Will Ladislaw, and quite a lot of the book revolves around the tensions in that particular triangle. It also deals with Tertius Lydgate, who makes the marriage into a somewhat impoverished but still relatively important family in Middlemarch. This adaptation won a fair few awards and also popularised the novel, so much so that Middlemarch topped the bestseller list for about 5 weeks during and after the transmission of the show. We move on to the big one. This is 1995, and this is Andrew Davies' adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. While Middlemarch had been a national success, Pride and Prejudice becomes an international phenomenon. This is, almost without question, the most dominant interpretation of Pride and Prejudice in the English-speaking world. You almost can't make a sentence about Andrew Davies without mentioning his adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. It has inspired retellings, modernisations, continuations, and various other adaptations of Pride and Prejudice and other Jane Austen works, and quite possibly resuscitated and brought into prominence the Regency romances, once the territory of Georgette Hare and Barbara Cartland. Pride and Prejudice was shot on location and in Super 16mm, which meant it was easier to convert it to high-definition formats like Blu-ray later in the day. Andrew Davies had actually been thinking about this adaptation since the late 80s and had been shopping it around. He was unfortunately shopping it around when the BBC had kind of put a hiatus on its bonnet dramas. He also spoke about sexing the book up, which caused a lot of commentators in the years before the adaptation came out to clutch at their pearls and wonder how somebody could do something so terrible to a respectable old book like Pride and Prejudice. And Andrew Davies makes a number of changes to this book, and this is a source of some problems for me. In the book, Jane Austen is pretty much camped out in Elizabeth Bennet's head. I mean, she does go elsewhere occasionally, but she is mostly sitting in Lizzie's head, looking at what she's thinking and seeing through her eyes. Andrew Davies wanted to transfer the focus slightly over to what's going on in Mr. Darcy's head. And I can't help feeling that we lose out on seeing what's going on in Elizabeth Bennet's head. Certainly this change of focus worked in favour of the adaptation. It made a star of Colin Firth and almost put the lie to the idea that English Collins are always a disappointment. Colin Firth is the exception that proves this rule, and if you look at his career before Pride and Prejudice, you can see that while it is of great interest, it is somewhat disappointing. This change of focus has really led me to have some problems with this adaptation. It's difficult to say that it's nothing to do with Andrew Davies' approach, because it is the fact that Andrew Davies' take on Pride and Prejudice is now the dominant take on Pride and Prejudice. Every time people talk about Pride and Prejudice, they seem to expect you to have Andrew Davies' adaptation going on in your head. And that's a bit of a problem. The focus going from Elizabeth to Darcy means that some situations lose their original book meaning. The most prominent of these is after Elizabeth has told Jane of how much she is in love with Mr. Darcy, Jane asks when Elizabeth fell in love with Mr. Darcy. In both the book and the series, Elizabeth somewhat jokingly says, "Oh, well, when I saw his great house at Pemberley." In the book, this is very clearly a joke. We have followed in great detail how Elizabeth slowly and gradually falls in love with Mr. Darcy. Certainly, her love for Mr. Darcy really begins when she meets him at Pemberley, but it is not until she has fled Derbyshire and is back in Longbourn that she realises that she does in fact love him. And although Jennifer Ely treats it as a joke, when she says it, it doesn't quite come across that, and too many people have misinterpreted her line as entirely mercenary. The way people seem to base their appreciation of Pride and Prejudice on Andrew Davies's adaptation makes me very angry. It doesn't make me angry at the adaptation, but it wouldn't be there if the adaptation wasn't there. If I can calm down enough, I will probably make a video about it. I've already made the artwork for that video. We move on to 2001, by which time Andrew Davies is very well established as an adapter of classics, and we get to his adaptation of Anthony Trollope's The Way We Live Now. After Pride and Prejudice and Middlemarch, this doesn't quite move the needle as much as those two, but it does recreate a certain amount of interest in Anthony Trollope, and it enabled Andrew Davies to go on to adapt He Knew He Was Right, and look towards adapting Anthony Trollope's Palliser novels. Unfortunately, in 2009, the plans to adapt the Palliser novels fell foul of a recurrence of the BBC fearing that it was turning into the British Bonnets Corporation. So those plans were scrapped. The Way We Live Now tells the story of Augustus Melmotte, who arrives in London under a slight cloud, his bank in Vienna having failed. But he very quickly gets back on his feet and starts up a scheme for South American railways, and gets all the great and the good to invest in them. He also shops his daughter as a marriage prospect to various eligible men around town, and eventually stands for Parliament and wins. Of course, in the end, his schemes all fall flat, and he is left broke and destitute. What's the idea of a businessman who bankrupts himself constantly becoming a senior politician is utterly preposterous. It could never happen in the real world. Anthony Trollope is one of those authors who it feels as if he's sitting next to you pointing out the good bits in his writing. And if he wasn't such a good writer, this might come across as extremely conceited. He's also very keen to point out the fun bits in his novels and the foibles of the societies that he's writing about. And again, with Andrew Davies, I'm not sure that this entirely comes across successfully in the adaptation, but the adaptation was certainly extremely successful and garnered awards. The next book steps away from 19th century adaptations to an adaptation of a 20th century book. However, it still stays in a 19th century setting. This is Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters, written in 1998 and adapted in 2002. The story tells of Nan, a young woman in 19th century England who gets involved with Kitty, a cross-dressing musical performer. They develop a relationship and indeed perform together on the stage. But when that relationship breaks up, Nan drifts into a darker world of lesbianism in London. Andrew Davies claimed to be interested in this book because it, to him, read like a version of Pride and Prejudice with a lot of sex in it. Andrew Davies throughout his career is somebody who enjoys putting sex into his adaptations. Often when an author might imply sex or have sex happening behind a closed door, Andrew Davies in his adaptations will kick the door open and pull the covers off so you can see the bodies squirming underneath. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but perhaps sometimes you lose some of the subtlety and the emphasis. Andrew Davies said at the time that some of his inspirations for this book was his interest in Victorian erotica. Now, I read and enjoyed Sarah Waters' Tipping the Velvet and a number of her other books as well. And while both Sarah Waters and Andrew Davies focus on Nan's coming of age and her awakening lesbianism, Andrew Davies does seem to be rather distracted by illustrating the use of dildos. The last of the adaptations by Andrew Davies that I'm going to talk about is his first attempt at a full-length Dickens novel. He adapted a short story called The Signalman in the late 1970s, but in 2005, Andrew Davies adapts Bleak House. This adaptation is 8 hours long, but it had 15 episodes. The first episode was an hour long, and then for the next 7 weeks there were 2 half-hour episodes per week, which were placed on consecutive days just after EastEnders, which is the BBC's long-running soap and its most popular drama programme. This at the time caused a great stir. It is possibly the most popular BBC dramatisation of a Dickens novel. And the half-hour serialised format, as well as matching Dickens' own efforts of serialising his books, created the sort of water-cooler moments that every drama producer hopes for. It was also one of the first BBC dramas shot specifically in high definition, and once again on location and with pretty naturalistic lighting. And also, in some scenes, pretty naturalistic sweatiness as well. It does seem that minimal makeup was used. One of the problems that arose from this adaptation is that it was something of a victim of its own success. Charles Dickens liked to go in for some fairly comical and elaborate names, and when paired in the adaptation with some rather comical and elaborate hairstyles, this did become the focus of the appreciation of the novel. Too many silly names, too many silly hairdos. And it's perhaps what led eventually, some years later, for the BBC to once again run away from being the British Bonnets Corporation. It is probably worth mentioning some of Andrew Davies' more recent work, which includes adaptations of long books like War and Peace, Les Miserables, and A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth. These adaptations, while in themselves pretty good, do suffer slightly for me from the fact that they are caught into a pint pot. One of the stories told about his adaptation of this book is that he physically gets the book and tears it apart to get at the essentials of the story, the essence of the plot. And while it is well done, it's often you feel that there could be more said. And his most recent work, of course, is probably his 3 seasons of Sanditon, which is his continuation of Jane Austen's unfinished novel. Finally, I'm going to talk about not an adaptation by Andrew Davies, but an adaptation of Andrew Davies. This is Andrew Davies's 1992 novel, Bee Monkey. And it was adapted in 1998 as a movie, starring Asia Argento, Jared Harris and Rupert Everett, along with a cast of really interesting looking British character actors. Bee Monkey is written in the style of A chapters and B chapters. A is Anthony, a teacher who moonlights in a hospital radio station late at night as a jazz DJ. B is Beatrice, or Bee Monkey, a name she uses when she carries out daring jewellery heists. They come together. She is looking for something away from the criminality of her life, and he is looking for more excitement in his. I'm not going to claim this is a great novel or even a great film. It is certainly very, very interesting, and if you're a Andrew Davies completist, it is something very well worth seeing. But it's probably a 3 out of 5 star film rather than a 5-star or a 4-star film. So that's my personal selection of favourite or interesting Andrew Davies adaptations. Please feel free to put some of your favourites in the comments. Obviously, your most favourite is probably going to be Pride and Prejudice. We have to live with that. But if you do plan to do your own video on Andrew Davies, please let me know. I hope you enjoy this, and goodbye.